Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for this invitation to speak at the fourth session of the UN Forum on Human Rights, Democracy and Rule of Law. My name is Claudia Chwalisz, and I'm the founder and CEO of DemocracyNext, which is a non-partisan, non-profit research and action institute. I was glad to be asked to speak on this panel in particular about inspiring examples for change. For the past decade, I've been researching and also actively involved in designing and building and bringing to life new democratic institutions. How I came to be doing this started with research that I was doing for my first book on populism, which explored the political drivers of it. The extent to which people's disillusionment with politics, with the system, with feeling of not being able to have a say in shaping the decisions affecting your life was a driver of this. From my own research and that of others, I became convinced that this was one of the deeper underlying factors of this trend, and that different types of policies imposed top-down do not really get to the heart of that deeper driver, a feeling of a lack of agency. So this was the beginning of my research on democratic innovation. What are the ways in which governments around the world can try to give people a greater say and evolve their democratic institutions to do so? And that research and questioning hasn't stopped. I want to focus my intervention today around three questions. What if elections were not the heart of democracy? What if we shifted political and legislative power to everyday people? And what if we reintroduced the democratic practice of selecting assemblies by lot instead of by election? A few weeks ago, I was in Athens. On one of the opposite hills from the Parthenon lies the Pnyx, the place where the Athenians gathered for their assemblies to deliberate together. In the Agora, there's a machine called the Kleroterion, a sophisticated machine that the Athenians used to select people by lot for their different assemblies. These democratic principles of participation, representation by lot, and deliberation are nothing new. And in fact, the idea of democracy as deliberation and democracy entailing equal rights and power are widespread and at the heart of democratic practices in indigenous communities and many non-Western cultures as well. Their roots go far, far deeper than just ancient Athenian times. As the author Jay Griffiths wrote in Wild, accepting that there are different ways of knowing and different ways of speaking is the beginning of democracy. In the long span of history, it's actually relatively recently that democracy has come to be equated with elections. Not that elections are anything new, but what has changed is that there came a turning point when we started calling them democratic. The ancient Greeks knew well that elections lead to short-termism and polarization. They mean that only a narrow few have true power. In their words, they create oligarchies. Hannah Arendt also highlighted this perversion in On Revolution in 1963 when she wrote, "Representative government has in fact become oligarchic government. What we call today democracy is a form of government where the few rule." When we look back to the French and American revolutions and the construction of the institutions that have been replicated and modeled to some extent in countries across the globe, the systems that today we call the democracies, they were intentionally designed to be oligarchic. The word democracy was never used to describe them. It was representative government. And only much later, as suffrage was expanded, did the term morph into representative democracy. Democracy was essentially enshrined as elections in the 1948 UN Universal Declaration on Human Rights. And today we now often call this system democracy tout court. Don't get me wrong. Fairly done, this kind of representation was and is an improvement on some of the alternatives. Absolute monarchs, religious and ideological monopolies on power, or tyrannical dictatorships. But just because something is more democratic doesn't make it our ideal democracy. I think that in the moment of crisis that we're living in today, with so many people feeling disillusioned with the system, feeling powerless to really truly shape the decisions that are affecting their lives, we need to question what have become our assumptions. So what if elections weren't the heart of democracy? What if we shifted political and legislative power to everyday people? And what if we reintroduced the democratic practice of selecting assemblies by lot instead of by election? I invite you to imagine what this might look like. Close your eyes, take a deep breath, sit comfortably in your seat. Imagine that today is November 25th, 2032. This morning, before heading to the 9th session of the UN Forum on Human Rights, Democracy and Rule of Law, you found a letter in your mailbox, an invitation to be considered for your country's new Executive Assembly. Just like the other people who received this invitation at random, if you choose to accept, it means putting your name in the hat for a second lottery to ensure that members of this top decision-making body will broadly and equally represent society's diversity. Yes, last year your partner was invited to serve on the Climate Policy Assembly. What surprised the most was that after all the deep-felt discussions, the Assembly was able to find common ground on so many difficult issues, from energy sources and subsidies to renewables investment and extreme weather mitigation plans. Your best friend was on the most recent Judiciary Selection Commission, set up to take the partisanship out of the appointment of judges. And a few years back, your 16-year-old daughter was a member of the Legislative Assembly. Like jury duty, anybody selected by law is entitled to paid time off work to take up their civic duties. Childcare, transport, and other costs are covered. You receive a good state salary for your time, the same way elected officials were once paid. And what is the task in these assemblies? To weigh evidence, to listen to one another, and to find common ground on policy and legislative proposals. Members of all of these deliberative assemblies are selected by sortition, meaning by lottery. Rather than going to the ballot box once every 5 years, there are regular lotteries for different assemblies all the time. Instead of parties and professional politicians, ordinary citizens, people like me and you, your mum, your dad, your brothers, sisters, friends, colleagues, we're the ones in charge, taking turns representing others and being represented. As you travel home from the UN Forum, you think, yes, I'm definitely going to volunteer for the Executive Assembly. I invite you to open your eyes and return to 2022. This dream of a new system of democracy can come true, even if achieving it within a decade may seem ambitious. We don't have all the details of what this could look like, but is it really so radical to suggest that everybody should have equal political power? Is it so radical to imagine new institutions that recognize people's agency and dignity, that channel our collective wisdom, and that enable us to find common ground? We have the evidence and foundations for such a genuinely democratic future already being laid. Before founding Democracy Next, I established and led the OECD's work on the future of democracy and innovative citizen participation. With my colleague Geneva, who has now founded Democracy Next with me, we analyzed around 600 examples of citizens' assemblies around the world. To better understand what makes them work, developing standards for good practice to ensure they're effective, legitimate, and democratic. So Democracy Next isn't starting from scratch. We are building on and combining ideas from a growing deliberative wave of over 600 examples of citizen assemblies around the world. There are pioneers who've been showing us over and over again that deliberative democracy can work in a modern context. In these assemblies, everyday people are selected by lottery, proving time and time again that we are able to come together across diversity, to grapple with complexity, to listen to one another, and to decide together. I've been incredibly inspired by all these examples where everyday people have been finding original and thoughtful solutions to the problems that politicians have been stuck on. 150 people reflecting the diversity of French society were selected by lottery to form the French Citizens' Convention on Climate from October 2019 to June 2020. Over 9 months, they deliberated on and proposed legislation and regulation on how France can reduce its greenhouse gas emissions by 40% by 2030 in a spirit of social justice. In Ireland, citizens' assemblies have become common practice at the national level for 10 years now. Some of the most prominent examples include the assemblies where 100 randomly selected Irish people deliberated over numerous months on the constitutional issues of same-sex marriage and abortion. They recommended the government hold referendums to make constitutional change happen on these issues. And the citizens proposed how the legislation should change should people vote for constitutional change in the referendums. Permanent citizens' assemblies already exist as well. Together with other experts, I was involved in designing the world's first Citizens' Council with people selected by lottery in Ostbelgien, the German-speaking community of Belgium, in 2019. It was a demand that came from the President of the Parliament and the President of the government, who wanted to ensure that democratic institutions are evolving and wanted to embed the positive aspects of citizens' assemblies on an ongoing basis. The Ostbelgian Parliament voted unanimously across party lines to establish a legal mandate for what is effectively their second chamber of citizens' parliament. For sure, Ostbelgien is a small laboratory of 80,000 people, but the vice mayor of participation in the city of Paris, one of the largest economies in the world, was inspired by Ostbelgien's example and wanted the same for the French capital. Once again, I had the privilege of working with a group of others to design the Paris Citizens' Assembly, which has even more power than the Ostbelgian Citizens' Council. And most recently, I'm excited that a project I was involved in to design the first permanent Citizens' Assembly for Climate was announced in the region of Brussels just last week. Interest in establishing permanent citizens' assemblies is growing. What I hope is that we move from a situation where they are not just permanent, but also empowered as much as possible. At a time when so many feel disillusioned with politics, feel powerless to influence change, and are frustrated with the state of our countries and the world, these examples give me hope and inspiration that we could be building a genuinely democratic system founded on the principles of citizen participation, representation by lot, and deliberation. And I believe that many elected officials and public servants share these aspirations. I think the vast majority of people who go into politics do so with good and noble intentions to make change happen, and are just as frustrated as they experience the limitations of our existing systems. We need much more courageous leaders who are willing to continue experiments from within, to reimagine, evolve, and upgrade the political system's whole design. It's more important than ever that we don't give in to fatalism and we channel our energy into enabling change. Our choices are not limited to looking for another savior of our broken electoral politics, or being tempted by the siren call of autocracy and its false promise of easy solutions. We can shift political and legislative power towards citizens' assemblies. We can create a system where we all have equal political rights, where we take turns representing and being represented. We can work to establish parliaments and assemblies with people selected by lottery rather than election. Together with a group of international policymakers, democracy practitioners, activists, writers, philosophers, and quite simply citizens, we set up Democracy Next because we believe that another democratic future is possible. But we won't get there alone. Those of you sitting in this room and watching this online can also be agents of change and transformation. We invite you to join us in this mission of shifting power to people and building new institutions for the next democratic paradigm. Together, we can work to make another democratic future a reality. Thank you very much.